Welcome to Training 102. This is the continuation of the Training 101 video. And today we're going to continue to talk about the muscle and strength pyramid. We're going to talk about adherence, volume, intensity, and frequency, progression, exercise selection, rest periods, and then tempo. So let's get into it here. So first, let's take a quick peek back at the muscle and strength pyramid from Training 101. So these are the levels of the muscle and strength pyramid, with the lowest levels being the most important and the levels on top being less important. And essentially what we had talked about previously was that if you can't accomplish the lower levels, then there's no reason to even worry about the upper levels. So it all starts with adherence, just being able to stick to doing exercise. And then we worry about the volume, the amount of training that you're doing, the intensity of that training, and then how frequently you train. But of course, if you can't adhere to even doing your workouts, then level 2, the volume, intensity, and frequency doesn't really matter. And that kind of logic continues up the pyramid. So let's talk about the bottom of the muscle and strength pyramid, which is adherence. So this is basically asking, is what you're doing sustainable for the long term? And there are really 3 important conditions that we need to meet for training adherence. The first one is what you're doing realistic? So what's the time frame for your goal? Have you given yourself enough time to achieve your end goal? So for example, if you want to lose 100 pounds, for example, and you give yourself 3 months, is that realistic? No, definitely not. And then schedule. So does the plan that you have fit within your daily and weekly schedule? Like if you're thinking, I'm going to work out 6 days a week, is that realistic with your schedule? And secondly, is it enjoyable? So is this something that you enjoy and can do this way for a long period of time? And I want to talk about optimal as well, because optimal and enjoyable are not the same thing, because optimal does not always equal sustainable. So therefore we have to ask ourselves, is there even such thing as optimal? Because honestly, what's optimal is what you can adhere to and do for the long term. And then thirdly, we have the aspect of flexibility. So can you accommodate what you're doing with, unexpected changes occurring in your life? So flexibility is really like a requirement of the previous 2 conditions. And it's based on what's realistic and what's enjoyable. And the fact that that may change over time based off of what you find to be enjoyable, what your interests are, or what's fun and what's challenging. And what's realistic, of course, is also going to change over time as well as your schedule changes, or if you get a different job. And this diagram is a great representation of why having training that's enjoyable is more important than training that is optimal. So this shows that enjoyment results in you training harder, which results in you getting results, seeing those changes that you want. And when you see the results, you enjoy it more, and then you train harder and you continue to get results, and just goes on and on. It's a good cycle. Next, we've got volume, intensity, and frequency. So volume is basically the total amount of work that you perform. So that's like the exercises and the amount of exercises that you do. Intensity is the total amount of effort that you exert. And then frequency is how the previous 2 are basically scheduled. So aside from adherence, these are basically the foundation of all training that you do. And these 3 variables are interrelated, and they can't really be separated from each other. They all go together. So each one affects the other, and they can do so in different ways. So firstly, volume is very important for hypertrophy. And hypertrophy, again, is the increase and growth in muscle cells, so resulting in larger and stronger muscles, which is really important to have larger muscles for the toned look that a lot of people want. They want to be able to see a little bit of the muscle beneath the skin. So generally speaking, 10 to 20 sets per muscle group or movement is needed per week for hypertrophy. And this does vary based on your training age, which is like how experienced you are. So this chart is kind of a good look at what you should be doing based off your training age. So for a novice, we're looking at maybe about 10 to 12 sets per muscle group per week. And then training about 2 to 3 times total per week. Intermediate, we're looking at about 13 to 15 weekly sets per muscle group, and we're looking at training 3 to 4 times per week total. And then an advanced trainer is looking at about 16 to 20 sets per muscle group per week. And we're looking at training probably 3 to 5 times per week as an advanced trainer. And as an example, so if we're thinking of like a novice trainer, you might have 12 sets of back in a training session, so 12 back exercises, basically, and do 2 back sessions per week, which could break down into 4 sets of like a pull down movement, 4 sets of a dumbbell row, or 4 sets of seated rows to make up that total of 12 sets that you need as a novice trainer. Intensity is also important, but it's often kind of not really understood correctly. So many people gauge intensity based off of subjective feelings, like are they sore or are they sweating and out of breath in their workout, for example. But intensity is much better described and measured from an objective standpoint. And this really refers to the intensity of the load, so how much weight. And we can use percentages or RPE scales, and RPEs are the rating of perceived exertion. So this first scale is looking at the intensity based on the percentage of your 1 rep max. So RM is your rep max. And then if we look at this scale, we see that if you're doing 95% of what your 1 rep max is, you should be able to do about 2 reps with that weight. And if we look down further, if you're doing 80% of your 1 rep max, you should be able to do about 7 to 8 repetitions of that weight. And then if you're doing, for example, 70% of your 1 rep max for an exercise, you should be able to get about 11 or 12 reps with that weight. And then the next scale here is the rating of perceived exertion based on repetitions in reserve. So how many reps you have left over, essentially. So if you're rating your exercise that you just did as a 10, that means that you should not have been able to do any more reps at all. Like you were maxed out, you went to failure, which we don't always want to do, by the way. If you said, okay, yeah, the exercise that I just did, it felt like an 8 for the rating of perceived exertion. That equates to, I could probably have done about 2 more repetitions in that set before I failed. And if you said it was like a 5 or a 6 or something, that means you could probably do maybe 4 to 6 more repetitions before you would have completely failed. So when it comes to recommendations and what you should do for intensity, if your goal is hypertrophy, then the weight needs to be just heavy enough to be challenging. So what that kind of breaks down into is that the weight should be at least 30% of what your 1 rep max is for whatever exercise it is that you're doing. And if we look at the RPE scale, you should be rating the exercise that you're doing at least a 5. So meaning you should have 4 to 6 or less reps left over when you do an exercise. And when we look at what we should be doing for rep range and what the rating of perceived exertion is for hypertrophy, we want to be performing about 2/3 of the volume that we're training with in the 6 to 12 rep range and rating it between a 5 to a 10 on that RPE scale up here. And then the rest of the volume, which is 1/3 left over, should be done in either the 1 to 6 or the 12 to 20, or it can be a combination of both. So the 1 to 6 rep range or the 12 to 20 rep range. And again, that should be at a rating of a perceived exertion of 5 to 10. And you'll notice that within my programming for you, we don't do the 1 to 6 rep range often, and that's okay. And you may not have done it all yet because it's kind of dangerous for trainers that aren't as experienced, that are novice, and sometimes even intermediate, because we're using quite heavy weights when we're doing a true 1 to 6 rep range and challenging ourselves. So usually you'll see I'll program for you either somewhere in the 6 to 12 rep range, and sometimes you'll see it creep up into the 12 to 20 rep range as well. Now, if you're training for strength, not hypertrophy, then a large portion of the volume needs to be performed with a lot heavier loads. So This doesn't mean that the volume should be as heavy as possible all the time though, so keep that in mind. So when we want to train for strength, 2/3 of what we're doing, so 2/3 of the volume, should be in the 1 to 6 rep range. And your rating of perceived exertion should be in the 5 to 10 range. And then 1/3 of that volume, the leftover amount, should be in the 6 to 15 rep range with a rating of perceived exertion of 5 to 10. Now let's move on to frequency here. So frequency kind of brings together the volume and the intensity factors. It's basically how you kind of spread out your training across a given week. So the recommendation here, kind of like we saw earlier, is novices should train 2 to 3 times per week, intermediates about 3 to 4, advanced 3 to 5, or maybe even 4 to 5. Now let's move on to progression. We're kind of stepping up the pyramid now. This is like a concept of how you increase the training stimulus and make things more challenging. So I want to note here first though, progression and progressive overload are not the same thing. So progressive overload is like a concept of just gradually increasing the total load that you do for training sessions. And progression is the concept of just moving towards a more advanced state in general. So let's talk about just examples of progressing. So it could be lifting the same load for an increased distance, so a greater range of motion. So for example, if you could only squat down to, part way, like maybe 45 degrees, but now you can go all the way down to 90 degrees or more, then that's progression. You're doing more range of motion. Lifting the same load with better form or more control and less effort, that's like an increase in efficiency. So you're doing the same stuff just with better form and it's easier now. And then we've got lifting the same load with less rest time in between sets. So this is an example of density. You're doing more in a smaller amount of time. So for example, going from a 2-minute rest period between a set to 1 minute. Then we've got lifting a load with more speed and acceleration. So this is intensity. You're doing the same stuff, you're just kind of doing it faster. And then doing more work in the same amount of time is another example of density. You're doing more in that given amount of time. So like you're still doing the same workout that took 1 hour, but you're getting more stuff done in the workout. So you're putting more into that workout and still getting it done in 1 hour. And then lastly is doing the same work in less amount of time. So an example of density again. So this is, for example, like maybe you're doing a workout that used to take you 1 hour, but now when you do that same workout, it takes you 45 minutes. All right, let's step up a little bit further to exercise selection. So this is choosing which exercises you should do or not do. And the importance of exercise selection really depends on the perspective that you have and the goals that you have for yourself. So you might have athletic related goals, maybe for a certain sport, or performance goals, maybe hypertrophy just to build a little bit more muscle, or physique to shape your physique in a certain manner, for example. That all is going to influence the exercises that you choose. And for most people in the general population, the hypertrophy perspective works best and is just the easiest to work with and get results from. So some reminders to consider here. Not everyone has to do a specific exercise. There's not a requirement that everybody, has to do a bicep curl or something to reach their goals. But the goal really here is to just achieve all the planes of movement for overall health and, just capability with regards to what your body can do. But however, there are multiple ways to achieve that goal. So there's not just one way to do things. And this chart here gives you kind of a good overview of the different movement patterns, the muscle groups that they target, and then the secondary muscle groups that are also involved in the movement pattern. So for example, we've got squats. All variation of squats basically largely target the quads, which is the front of your legs, and the glutes, which is your butt. And secondary muscle groups that are involved in this movement are the erectors. So that would be like the muscles that run up your back on either side of your spine. And say if we looked at like a horizontal push, so this is something that's going to be working your chest and then the anterior delts, which is the front of your shoulder here. And the secondary muscle groups that it'll involve are your triceps, and it may even involve your anterior, or I should say your side delts here, basically. And then we've got compound movements and isolation movements. So compound exercises are basically exercises that work multiple muscle groups at the same time. So a squat, like we have up here as an example, we've got quads and glutes. And compound exercises allow for greater efficiency and allow you to move heavier weights because we have multiple muscle groups working at the same time. And oftentimes we want to shoot for 1 to 2 compound exercises for each major muscle group when we're training. Now, isolation exercises, they work only one specific muscle group at a time. So that's like doing a bicep curl, for example. That's just for your bicep on your arm. And this allows for greater focus and a lot more exercise selection with ways to target that single muscle that you're interested in working. And usually we look for about 1 to 3 isolation exercises for each muscle group in a session. So when it comes to order of exercises, this is also kind of interesting here. So we want to consider the fact that we're able to perform more volume with exercises at the beginning of the session. So in most cases, we want to be putting our compound exercises that work multiple muscle groups at the start of the workout. So these are the heaviest or the most complex, the most fatiguing, and they can be a higher risk as well. Then after those compound movements, we usually want to have our isolation exercises. These are also sometimes called accessories. They basically kind of fill in the rest of the workout. They're lighter, they use a single muscle, they're less difficult, and they're lower risk. And then we come to rest periods. So rest periods is just the time of rest that you have in between your sets. And until you have everything else figured out and optimal and you're doing everything else right, it doesn't really have much effect. And the goal should not be to be out of breath the entire workout. That doesn't mean that you're having an effective workout. And the same goes for, just sweating like crazy. That doesn't mean that you're having a great workout either. Really what happens here is that the individual's goal and training style is going to determine the best and optimal rest period. So general recommendations for rest periods are 45 to 90 seconds between smaller muscle groups or isolation exercises. So that could be like a bicep curl, for example, or a exercise like a tricep extension that exercises your triceps, or maybe like a calf raise. And about 90 to 150 seconds, which is a minute and a half to about 2.5 minutes between larger muscle groups or the compound exercises like a squat or a deadlift or like a barbell row or something. And you'll probably notice that in my programming, oftentimes we have shorter rest periods. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that a lot of my clients just don't have enough time in their day to have, a 90-second or 120-second rest period between every single set of an exercise. So as a result, that's why I see and expect my clients to use smaller loads, a little bit less weight for the exercises because of the rest periods being a little bit decreased. So moving on here, we've got antagonist paired sets, another way to train here. So these are great for pretty much anybody at any level of training that really want to increase their efficiency and keep their training duration short. And this kind of circles back to what we were talking about with having shorter rest periods in the workouts that I give to my clients. So an example of an antagonist paired set is a superset. And it's basically performing 2 different exercises back to back without rest. An example is like performing a bicep curl and then doing something for your triceps. We're working 2 different muscles, but we're cutting out the rest period in between the sets of this exercise because they're different muscles. This is going to tax your cardiovascular system a little bit more, but still allow you to get quite good performance when you're doing the exercise for each of the given muscle groups. So recommendations, if you're doing a superset, between each superset, you have a rest period. And if you're doing an isolation exercise or 2 isolation exercises in your superset, like a bicep curl and a tricep extension, you need about a minute of rest in between. But if you're doing compound exercises, for example, like a bench press or a barbell row, then you need about 2 minutes of rest in between the superset of the compound exercises. And lastly here, we're going to talk about tempo. So tempo is the least important thing. It really doesn't matter unless you figure everything else out that we just talked about and you got everything else down 100% and you're doing it right. So tempo is the speed at which reps are completed. So until everything else is optimal, this has the smallest effect. And to fully maximize tempo, you really need to understand the two motions of an exercise. So there's a concentric movement, which is the act of shortening the muscle. So if you do like a bicep curl as you raise the weight up, your bicep contracts and gets shorter. That's the concentric movement. Or if you're doing a bench press and you're pushing the weight away from yourself, you're moving it up, the raising portion, your chest, your pec kind of contracts and gets shorter and smaller. And then there's the eccentric, which is the act of lengthening the muscle. So that's like when you're letting the weight down doing a bicep curl and your muscle is getting longer. So the lowering portion. And you can alter the tempo in each of those motions, concentric and eccentric, to just change the stimulus of the exercise. And related to tempo is time under tension. So a faster tempo, meaning you're doing the exercise much faster for the concentric and eccentric portions we talked about, means less time under tension. And a slower tempo, meaning we're taking more time to do the exercise, means increased time under tension. So increasing the length of time under tension basically increases the stimulus on the muscle because we're exercising and working the muscle for a longer period of time. And this can increase strength and hypertrophy without increasing the load. But again, if you don't have everything else down that's prior to tempo, don't even worry about this.